This is Land of Havilah, Mark 9b. Coming up, Jesus has been absent, along with Peter, James, and John. They've been to the Mount of Transfiguration. When they rejoin the other disciples, they'll see a crowd around them, including some scribes grilling them with questions. Verse 14. Coming to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them and scribes questioning them. Comment, when the multitude saw Jesus approaching, verse 15. Immediately all the multitude, when they saw him, were greatly amazed, and running to him, greeted him. He asked the scribes, "What are you asking them?" One of the multitude answered, "Teacher, I brought to you my son who has a mute spirit, and whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and wastes away. I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they weren't able." Comment, there was a demon that the disciples couldn't cast out. That's apparently what the scribes were asking about, as in, where are the healing miracles that you've supposedly been doing? Verse 19. He answered him, "Unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me." They brought him to him, and when he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him, and he fell on the ground, wallowing and foaming at the mouth. He asked his father, "How long has it been since this has come to him?" He said, "From childhood." Comment, in verse 19, we all know Jesus' reputation that he was kind, gentle, considerate, loving, and the like, but if there was anything that irritated him, it was unbelief. Quote, "Unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you?" End quote. Probably Jesus didn't direct this comment so much to the poor father who was pleading for his son, but to the scribes who were questioning the disciples' ability to do anything about it. In verse 21, the son was probably in his teens, since the father said he was affected from childhood. But verse 26 coming later will indicate he's still a boy. In verse 17, the father said a mute spirit was the problem, but in addition to being mute, the son had violent seizures. Apparently it happened so frequently there wasn't enough time between seizures to recover and eat properly, because he was wasting away in verse 18. In verse 20, when Jesus and the son saw each other, the spirit immediately went into action. The son fell amid the crowd, wallowed on the ground, convulsing, grinding his teeth, and foaming at the mouth. Coming up as this was happening, the father kept explaining. Verse 22. "Often it's cast him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." Jesus said to him, "If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out with tears, "I believe, help me in my unbelief." Comment, Jesus said he would help, quote, "if you can believe," end quote. The Father spoke for many of us when he answered, "I believe, help me in my unbelief." We believe and have faith, but we're not sure it's enough. Was it enough for the Father? Verse 25. When Jesus saw that a multitude came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to him, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him, and never enter him again." After crying out and convulsing him greatly, it came out of him. The boy became like one dead, so much that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and raised him up, and he arose. Comment, there was a great contrast between the violence of the seizure and then silence as the boy lay on the ground appearing to be dead. When everyone thought he was dead, they were proving Jesus correct that he called them an unbelieving generation. But just when they were sure of a bad outcome, he took the boy by the hand and raised him up. As long as Jesus is around, let's not be so quick to assume a bad outcome. Verse 28. When he had come into the house, the disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we cast it out?" He said to them, "This kind can come out by nothing except by prayer and fasting." Comment, there's an issue of biblical accuracy in verse 29 because of differences in Greek manuscripts. Because paper and such materials deteriorate, the original copies of all the books of the Bible deteriorated long ago. For example, we don't have Genesis in Moses' handwriting or Revelation in the Apostle John's handwriting. We only have copies of copies. The oldest complete Bible in existence dates to the 3rd or 4th century A.D. So the question arises, how accurate are the copies? To what degree did the scribes alter the Scriptures, either intentionally or through copying errors? We can answer that well because of the 66 books of the Bible. We have hundreds of very old manuscripts, older than the oldest complete copy, manuscripts of entire books or portions of books. Some of the Old Testament ones date prior to the time of Christ. Comparing them to the ones that are more recent, there's very little difference in them. There are words here and there that are different between the manuscripts, but none of the differences are enough to create a question about any major event or doctrine of the Bible. So the copying process was highly accurate from very early times. The scribes did a very professional job. We might suppose it was because they knew they were dealing with holy material, and we might suppose that God protected the accuracy of His Word. But there are some minor variations in manuscripts. Verse 29 that we just read is an example that on a handful of minor points it would be nice to know what the original version said. The question in verse 29 is whether it should read, quote, "This kind can come out by nothing except by prayer and fasting," end quote, or if fasting should be dropped so that it reads, "This kind can come out by nothing except by prayer." The manuscripts have it both ways, and it's a 50-50 toss-up which way it should read. This is according to a specialty discipline known as textual criticism, as explained on video by a scholar associated with Dallas Theological Seminary. Your narrator regrets he can't locate his name or he would cite him. Coming up for the third time in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus will teach about His death, burial, and resurrection, and again it won't register with His disciples. Verse 30. They went out from there and passed through Galilee. He didn't want anyone to know it, for He was teaching His disciples, and said to them, "The Son of Man is being handed over to the hands of men, and they will kill Him, and when He's killed, on the third day He'll rise again." But they didn't understand the saying and were afraid to ask Him. Comment: there was a matter of divine intervention that God the Father scrambled the disciples' brains so they couldn't understand Jesus' simple statement about His death and resurrection. It didn't register with them. They remembered He said it and even discussed it among themselves what rising from the dead meant, Mark 9:10. But as simple as it was, they couldn't get it. Now back at home base at Capernaum, verse 33. He came to Capernaum, and when He was in the house, He asked them, "What were you arguing among yourselves on the way?" But they were silent, for they had disputed one with another on the way about who was the greatest. Comment: Jesus was at the house, and meanwhile some of the disciples were on the way to the house. They argued along the way which of them was greatest. Being around Jesus and being chosen to be among the 12 got to their heads. When they got to the house in verse 33, Jesus asked, "What were you arguing about on the way?" In verse 34, their only answer was embarrassed silence. As soon as it hit them that Jesus had been listening all along, it sobered them up. So we should be sober in our conversation and aware that He's listening. As to who was the greatest, verse 35. He sat down and called the 12, and He said to them, "If any man wants to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all." He took a little child and set him in the middle of them. Taking him in His arms, He said to them, "Whoever receives one such little child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me doesn't receive me but Him who sent me." Comment: Jesus' answer in verse 35 about who is the greatest was that if any man wanted to be first, he should take last position. He should be servant of all. In verse 36, there was a little child in the house, a boy, Matthew 18:2. Maybe he was somebody's little relative, or since the house tended to be crowded with people seeking Jesus, Mark 2:4, it could have been anyone. Jesus called the boy over, Matthew 18:2, set him in the middle of them, took him in His arms, and said, quote, "Whoever receives one such little child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me doesn't receive me but Him who sent me," end quote. It's an honor to serve children. If we're serving God while we're serving children, that child should seem very, very big in our arms. we do well to be the least and serve the least. Mark 9c is next at landofhavilah.net, Mark 9c.